Okay, let's get Webpack building our JavaScript. I don't want to do that yet. I'm going to do entry is going to be list. Sorry, an object. So I want button to be source components. Button. And we want externals to be and get the Babel loader in here. And let's try and, I want to try and get our components outputting to the correct folder. All right, that's better. Cool. I'm gonna put dist in here. All right, so we have, we want our components to be output individually, so that if you only need one of them, you only have to bring in one of them. And you want it to not have, you don't want it to package dependencies. So if you see here that my button is just over 2 kilobytes. And if I removed externals from this configuration, what you're going to see now is that it's going to package all of the things it needs for button to run. So it's actually now it's huge. And we don't want that, and that's because it's including everything that is in here inside the output of button. So it's ridiculous. You don't want that. You want the user of your component to supply the dependencies for you. And the reason for that is, well, there's a bunch of reasons for that, but the main reason for that is that you don't want, if they are already using React in their application, React shouldn't come with a button they import. React should be supplied to the button if it requires that. So that's what we've done. I assigned the libraries that fall under that categorization of they need to be there at runtime, but I don't want to ship them. I put them in the peer dependencies, which tells npm when the user of this package installs it, npm will say, hey, it depends on these things. And the way I tell Webpack to ignore those things is I use the externals property, and I could have done it this way. Like I could list them all out, but there's a faster way that I like to do it, and just, well, if everything in peer dependencies is going to be an external, then I just read peer dependencies instead, right? So now when I build it, it leaves those out. So I only get the minimum required code for the button. So that's good. I also think I want to move this hovering out of here. But I want to get, maybe I don't want themes right now. I'm so used to doing themes, but maybe I don't need themes. No, I should use themes. So I want to be able to actually export this theme properly. So I really want this to work. I don't need this. I'm going to rename this to index, because this is going to be my default theme. And then light, I'm going to actually just get rid of this for the moment. So let's put a few values in here. Button border. Do I want to do this right now? Yeah, let's do this. Button border color. I don't know, auto. And then my button. And button background color. And button color, foreground color. Actually, I could just copy this. Border color. And color. So let's see what's going on here. Okay, so we have our button. Passing in the theme. The theme is getting injected into our button via Storybook right now. So this should just come from themes. I'm not even running this, so I don't know why I did that. npm start. All right, cool. Let's do a bit more. Let's give it a min width. Yeah, let's go to min width. 100 pixels, and let's give it some padding. And I just noticed that this is using emoji, but it's not using emoji and text. So that's good. Still not thrilled with how this looks, but let's make it's fine. Let's commit what we have right now. Initial working Webpack config and some cleanup. So I think I want styles in another file. I don't know if I do yet, but I think I do. And the reason I'm thinking about this right now is because I want to make like a template folder that I can just copy and paste and make lots of more components out of. So I kind of want to establish, I don't need to finalize my structure for my filing right now, but I kind of want to. So if I don't want my styles in each component, well, you know what? Yeah, I'm gonna leave it here for now. It's fine. So I'm gonna copy this, I'm gonna paste it, and I'm gonna make this called template. So this will be something I can copy and paste to create more components. And this will always be the same, so I don't have to. So this is gonna be a styled container. I'm gonna leave at least one theme option in here. I'm gonna make this something more generic. No, I'm not. I'm gonna. Yeah, I'm gonna leave that. And this is a class, but it doesn't have to be. But I am gonna definitely get rid of all this, and I'm gonna get rid of that. And I'm gonna leave bare bones. Just gonna make these all the same so I can do like a search and replace. I don't like the word buttons in here right now for my template, so I might actually just get rid of this. I could do this too. All right, and then this is gonna be get rid of default usage. Containers of style div. This is template. Template has one basic. Can you not use? Maybe you can't use underscores as a. Where the hell did my button go to? Yeah, okay, that was fine. It was just the auto reload was broken. But. All right, good. So I got a default empty component I can copy and paste now. Let's just add that. Let's push that. Push, 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 always push. All right, cool. Let's get rid of all this. Let's start putting some components together for real. H1. It's probably a faster way to do this, but basically only do it. Yeah, update my imports. Hell yeah. H1 and H1 and H1. And this will be lowercase h. And now we have an H1. Cool. And this is actually going to be a styled H1, not a styled div. Very cool. All right, so now we can start churning out components that quickly. So let's just copy this and do the other headings. H2. Oops, what did I just do? H2. H2. H2 dot stories. H2. H2. And we do the lowercase ones first, and then the uppercase H2. And actually, we don't need this at all. This is actually just going to be a plain styled component. So good. And I'm going to change H1 as also to be a regular style component. I don't need it to be a class. So H1 still works, good. Let's copy this and make, well, yeah, let's copy this. H3. 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 No, just do the lowercase ones first. H3. H3. Cool. H1, H2, H3. Very good. Let's do H4. Probably going to stop at 4. I know there's 6 of them, but I don't need them all right now. And I want to do some actual progress on these components so that if I figure out something different about these headings that I want to do, then I don't have to, I don't know, H5 and H6 will just fall into line. They won't have to be also redone. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, good. And my theme does not have H1 or any of these things. So I gotta figure out a better way to organize this theme, but for now, I'm gonna do H1 color. Actually, if I change this to blue, this should turn blue. Assuming I declared this correctly. Okay. I don't know why the autocomplete's not working for this. Pink. Yeah, so Storybook is not detecting that something changed with the theme. and it's not auto reloading, which I want to fix. How do I do that? It's watching my theme. So it should be reading. Like if I change this, does this auto reload? So it is trying to auto reload. So why isn't it respecting the fact that it's like it can't read this for some reason? Maybe I just need to. I'm gonna try restarting this. This probably shouldn't change anything, but let's just. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do at all. Oh, this isn't making noise, is it? Okay. Okay, so now I want to change this and hope that it reloads automatically. It's not doing that. It is though. When I save this file, it's actually reading it. But why is this not? Like, I don't want to have to refresh this every time I change a theme property. That defeats the whole point. If I do this, I wonder if this changes anything. Yeah, so that works. So it's working. It's working when I change the component, but not when I change the theme. I guess it's not the end of the world for now, but that's kind of annoying. Probably address that later. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know why that's happening. Anyways, let's commit. We had a whole bunch of stuff here, so let's commit our add h1 to h4 elements. Component. Well, whatever. I know what I mean. Component elements. There's another program that had a push on commit option, which I kind of wish this had. Well, what was I doing? Okay, so we got some headings components. Let's actually move this hovering. So I want to make another button. I'm gonna make this button secondary. Actually, there's no point in making Well, yeah, there is. Okay, let's do this. Let's make a secondary button. I'm definitely not going to have this state repeated. Definitely not. I also don't want these styles repeated. So I think the proper way to do this, and this is how I'm going to start, is I'm going to say, I don't need this. I'm going to say import button from, and we're going to go back up a directory to button. And then secondary button is going to be a styled button. And I'm going to make this use similar properties of the theme, but instead of button, it's going to be button secondary. And that should be a good start. And now if I go to my theme, my first theme, I can copy this and say secondary. And I can make the background color of this, for example, to make it super obvious. I'll make it black, and I'll make the front forecolor white. And let's see if now we have a secondary button. Cannot find button. Why can't you find button? Why can't you find that? Oh, yeah. Button secondary. Right, so now I have a primary button and a secondary button. And I'll just, hello. All right, so now I have a regular button with some styles, and I have a secondary button with some styles. That's good. That's the minimal viable proof of concept of extending a component's theme. So that's good. It doesn't matter what these values are right now, it just matters that there is the option of a secondary button. Oh, I just realized I called it secondary button in here, but I actually I named it button secondary. This doesn't matter because the name of this doesn't actually matter for what gets rendered, but obviously you want it to be consistent. I will be right back in 1 second. All right, we got a couple different components. I'm going to commit this. It's better to commit more frequently. Add button secondary. Okay, so we got a couple components here. Let's keep going. Let's make a what do we want to make? Chat, what do we want to make? Some component. Let's make a drop down. Copy our template. Drop down. Well, actually, we should make a select first, which is this will map to, the way I see it, you have a select, which is it maps one-to-one with the actual, well, this applies for all elements. I like to make the first one just being like the lowest level element. So the actual HTML element is a select. So I want to make that first, and then I will make a composite component called a dropdown, which will extend select. And this doesn't have to be class either, so we'll get rid of this and we'll get rid of that, and we'll change this to select. And of course this is not an element that you put, well, you do put children, but they're not just text, they're options. And actually that I should start with select. I should start with that because that's the lowest level element here. So I should make an option as well, but I'm going to call it select option, and this is possibly overkill, but I like to be consistent. So if you're going to have an element and you're going to extract all your element logic you're going to abstract all of your elements into components, you might as well do all of them and not just some of them. So let's just do this properly. And this is going to be a option, and the element is not uppercase but lowercase option. And then here in my select story, I'm actually going to make a select option, and I'm going to say this is option 1, 2, 3. Let's make sure that's well, first of all, this has to come. So select option actually doesn't have its own stories. Probably don't need this. In fact, maybe I don't even make a folder. I don't think this even needs a folder. I hate being inconsistent though. Like if you're looking through this and you're like, okay, I can find all the components in this folder, I don't want you to have to like go into, if you're like, oh, where is select option? I don't want you to have to go into select and then find option in here. But this is a unique case where this actually never gets used outside of a select, like never. There's no such thing as an option element outside of a select. So I'm gonna actually delete this. And I'm gonna make it part of select because it just makes sense in this case. So I'm gonna make select option component in here, and then this will be an option element. And now my select.stories, yeah, they grab it from here, and now this should work. Right, okay, great. Great. So I could say default usage, I could say no options. So we want to cover all the different use cases. Oops. So that's no options. And let's do one option. And let's do many options. And I will copy this. Yeah, I did 15 even just by accident. Nice round number. Okay, so we can look at our select and we can see like how does it render with these different types of data? And this looks kind of shitty, no options. Although arguably a select box with no options probably shouldn't. Probably is useless anyways. It's probably like a bug if you ever get this. But let's just put... Let's put some like styling to make that at least a little more pleasant to look at if nothing happens. So let's put a min width on here. So at least it kind of renders like, I don't even want to say in a useful way, but I don't know. It just won't collapse and like break the whole page. Anyways, it's probably not even necessary to do that. Like I said, that's pretty much an invalid state. As far as, it's not an invalid state technically, but it's an invalid state and like no program would ever have an empty dropdown for any good reason. So that makes it an invalid state to me. So let's just add our base select component. And now let's make, there's two ways to make a drop down. Well, let's keep going. Let's create an input. Don't need this. This is going to be an input. Oops. Input. Good. And now all right, what else? We need let's make a login. Do we want a login form? Let's make a login form. Yeah, let's make well, yeah, let's make a login form. Login form. Oops. this one is going to have, this is probably going to be a class. It's going to have state. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Login form. And our login form is going to probably have, I could leave it as children. I'm gonna leave it as children for now. It doesn't have anything yet. Well, actually, no, let's not. Let's actually make our login form. So what does a login form have? Import input from input. And oh, we need a label. So this is going to be a label, username. Label is not defined, so I'm going to import, I haven't created this yet, import label from label. So it's going to be label. And now let's create the label. Copy any of these, but I'll just copy this one. This will be label. This will be label. This will be label. This is going to be label. This is going to be lowercase label. This is going to be label. And actually, default usage for a label will have text in it. So this is a label. And now this should, no such, oh, input copy, what the heck? All right, Storybook, fix yourself. Cool, so we have a label and we have our form, which is nothing at the moment, but it's also gonna have a password. And this is going to be type equals password. Password. Never. All right, good. So now I have a input a username and a password, and I have a container. Hey, Link Slumps, how are you? So we also need a form, And I'm debating whether or not my container is just going to be the form. I think I can start with it as the form, and if there's a problem with that for whatever reason, I can fix it later. And I also want a component to surround these and align them. So I want to make a form group component. So I'm going to copy my label. Yeah, feature branching is, well, it depends what you mean, but yeah, I know how to feature branch. I'm not doing feature branches right now. I'm not sure why you're asking, but I'm not doing feature branches right now because I'm the only one working on this, and this is a brand new library. But yeah, sure, I can show you how to do that. Just give me 1 sec here. I'll finish this. So this is going to be a form field. Okay, I'll show you 1 sec. 1 sec. Form field. I don't want to leave this app in a broken state, so hold on a second. I'll fix this first. Form fields. What program are you using to work with Git? It's actually going to be a div. Desktop and CLI, okay. Form field. Okay, this should be working now. Yes, it is. All right, cool. Let me commit this and I'll show you how to make a feature branch. Add some more form components. I'll use the CLI so that I like this program, by the way. If you haven't tried, yeah, some of my other streams actually talked about why I prefer a GUI for Git. You can do everything on the command line, but I don't know, being able to see like your history like this to me is pretty valuable. You know, getting an overview like this without having to run a bunch of commands. But anyways, so creating a feature branch, I can do this through the CLI. So I'm on Git status. I'm on master. I only have one branch. But if you want to create then the name of this GUI is called Tower. It's actually a paid, it's paid software, but I'm using a trial right now. But there's another one called Source Tree, which is free. And this is very similar. I'm actually going to, you know what? So many people ask me this. I'm just gonna actually download this and use it at some point. But anyways, I'll show you how to do it. So a feature branch is really easy. So the reason you create a feature branch, as you probably already know, is to make a temporary place to work on stuff that you don't want in the main branch yet. So let's say I was going to create a new component here, and I don't want it to impact what's already here. So let's say I was going to create a, I don't know, it doesn't matter, but I'll just pick one. What's an HTML? I don't know. I'm going to make an H5. Let's say I'm going to make an H5, right? Yeah, so it's git checkout -b, and this gives you a new branch, and then you name it, so H5 work in progress or something. I actually wouldn't put work in progress. Another thing you can do is if you want to follow the Git flow standards, you would name it like this. You do features / and the only reason to do that, well, I guess there's a bunch of reasons. It's just a convention. You could differentiate feature branches from other branches, but it depends on the size of your team and your project. So if you don't have a lot of branches, like not using the feature convention is probably fine. But I'll use it just to be like super clear that I'm creating So that switches to this branch, right? So now if I do get status, shows me I'm on feature H5. So now I'll create an H5 component. And by the way, this is my typical workflow. I do actually work in feature branches all the time. But just because this is a new project and I'm the only one working on it, I haven't bothered. Like, it's not unnecessary right now. So I'm going to make my changes, yada, 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 H5. H5. This should be lowercase h. This should be uppercase, lowercase h. Yeah, so now I have some changes, and the big difference here, like, if I want to see what I've changed, I can do get status, and it shows me, oh, okay, I've got this new folder with some stuff in it, possibly, that's tracked. But, like, there's not a lot of useful information here. Whereas if I come here, I can already see that I've added 3 new files. And if I stage them all, which is the same as doing like git add. So now we should have the same status, right? Even if, like, I don't know what's in these, right? I have to, if I want to see like what's in each, and this doesn't make much sense because I'm adding a new file, but let's say I change something over here. Right? Let's say I made another modification. So now if I do get status, it's like, oh, well, what did I do to this file? And you could of course do git diff, you know, source components h1, and it shows me what I did, right? But that's a lot of work when I could just flip over here and look at this and see what I did, right? So it's like, I'm sure people can get really, really fast with this command line, but I don't see how you can compete with this overview of what's going on here without having to type anything. So this is my feature branch. I'm gonna actually commit this as well, just even though this is not a valid commit, I'm just gonna commit this just to make a point. So add new H5 and modify H1 for no reason, which I wouldn't normally do this, but, and, oh, right. So sorry, that what I just did was the same as a git commit, like this. Add H5, da, 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 da. That's what I just did using the GUI. And then I did, I'm going to do a push. Well, I already did a push, but that's what I would have done. And then if I go over to GitHub, I will see that, did I push? I didn't push this, sorry. So I'm going to push this up to GitHub. And now here I'll see that there's another branch I created. So now this is a feature branch. And you've got a feature branch. And when you're ready to merge this, depending on how you work, I usually use pull requests, but if you use a pull request, then you just pick your feature branch. And it shows you what your difference is from the master, right? And that's it. You can merge this at will. And that's how you create feature branches. If your master branch changes while this is going on, how do you undo the PR after you merged it? Well, don't get confused here with PRs and regular, like PRs are just like they're just an interface for that GitHub provides you. But when you do stuff with a PR, like when I hit merge, it's the same as if I was doing a git merge command. It's just in the form of a PR. So the answer to your question is, how do you undo a PR? Well, you're going to undo the merge, basically. So if I merge this, there happens to be another option that GitHub gives you, but you got to be careful with this, because if you just start relying on the options GitHub gives you, you're not going to actually know what's going on behind the scenes. And if you don't know what's going on behind the scenes, you might be fine for a while, but if you get into like a real messy situation, you're going to be like super confused. So one way to do it is to revert like this, which again, a revert, there's different types of reverts in Git, but you don't want to, like, you can either like actually go back in history and remove this commit that I just made, or you can create a new commit that reverses the previous commit. And I think that's the proper way to do it. And by proper, I mean, there is no actual proper way. You can do whatever you want. But I feel like if you remove your history from Git, you're asking for trouble. Whereas if you're like, well, I merged this, like merging is a thing that happened. So this happened, okay? I don't want this to not exist in the history of this. If I don't want this to be there anymore, I need to show that in the history, this thing was merged and then it was reverted. So this button here is going to create another PR that undoes what I did in the previous PR. And I would suggest doing it this way. But there's other, like, git commands to do this exist as well. I don't remember them all, and I don't really want to remember them all. That's why I use part of the reason I use a GUI, right? So if I didn't want this, actually can't revert this because I haven't pulled my changes in yet. So I'm on feature 5, so I'm gonna switch over to master again. And now I'm gonna pull the changes I just merged into master. So you could see here that this set of changes was merged in. And there's ways to like there's ways to do git where you can go back and do, like, get rid of this commit a million different ways. But yeah, if I were doing it, I would probably do it this way, where I actually just use the GitHub interface to undo what I just did through GitHub. You may be in yeah, I mean, that happens all the time. It's not like, yeah, it happens all the time. It's not like, that's just a common occurrence in when you're programming on something. But how to actually revert, you know, like if I just wanted to revert this change, there's probably a fancy way to do it, but I would just do it manually. Like I would say, well, if I don't want, well, actually I want to revert this change here, like this. I don't want this to have happened. So I would just do it manually, like put it back to the way it was. And now that's going to be a new commit here, where I'm going to say revert accidental change. Like, there's so many ways to do it. You changed 1 million files. That's a lot of files. Okay, so when you installed it, like, what is the commit? Did it add a bunch of stuff, or did it modify a bunch of stuff? Because that matters. Added a bunch. Okay, yeah, so adding is easier to fix. Um, Unfortunately, there's no like easy way to revert adding a million files. But if you merged it in a pull request, you could just hit the revert button like I did earlier, which I can't get back to that now because that state is gone. It's not a real thing anymore. But you did an merge in PR. You hit revert. What happened after you hit revert? And by the way, part of the reason you use a pull request is so that you can check. Part of the reason you have pull requests is so that you can see what's going on right before you merge it. And at my organization, my old organization, the developer that opened the pull request was not allowed to merge it because they could easily skip over changes that they accidentally included, and it's just good to have someone else look at that. Like, it's possible that when you looked at the merge, it didn't show you everything because it was too much for GitHub to handle, right? Because even like if you have a big file and you delete it, they don't show you the whole thing unless you like dig into their UI because it's too much data to show. Yeah. Um, yeah, and if you want to enforce stuff like that, you can do you can protect branches, and then you can say like require pull requests to be reviewed, and that's actually built into the GitHub UI, so it's pretty good. I'm not gonna do this right now because I don't have anyone else that would review this, but getting those permissions set up is pretty good. But anyway, that doesn't solve your situation. Your situation has happened. Um, if you have a lot of files and you can't do it through the GitHub UI, I'm not really sure how to help other than I assume the files are in directories. So if you went to your code base and just, found the directory like this and just delete it and then check with however you use Git, have a look and see what, if that solves your problem, and then make a new commit. I can merge revert back to my master fork. Yeah, the thing with Git is there's just lots of ways to do things. In the end, you just gotta be like, hey, yeah, you should make a new branch because, yeah, like even a fix for an accidental operation should be a new branch. Just because then you're not like you can always screw up a million times on branches. But if you screw up on the master branch or like one of the main branches, then you're just like there's no reason for that. It's so easy to create branches with Git. Like that's basically the point of Git, is to create branches. It's like really fast and lightweight. So yeah, like you could if you have like a history, you could revert your master branch to a history to a point before your commit was made. So, right, you could pick a commit in history and be like, um, reset to this commit. And there's so many ways to do this, and I'm actually not like a Git expert. I just know enough to to get stuff done. But yeah, you could. I mean, the history's there, right? So it's just a matter of finding the correct point in time that you want to go back to, and then deciding how you want to go back to that, right? So I don't know. Maybe the correct way is to do something like this. Like, I don't really want to do this right now because I don't want to add a whole bunch of stuff to this for no reason. But yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have like a straight answer for you because I'd need to actually like work with your repository. But definitely, you just want to go back in time before you made your commit, because even a pull request is just a merge. In the end, it's just a merge commit. So at some point before your merge, there was a history and there was a state of your code before that merge. And you just need to find a way that you're comfortable with to get back to that point in time. And you can do that on a feature branch as well. And I would suggest doing it that way. So then when you have your feature branch back to a state that you're comfortable with, then you just merge that feature branch, and that should get everything back to where you want it to be. So I hope that kind of answers your question. Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like you're on the right track. Um, just be careful. Every time something like that happens to me, it's like a reminder that I got to be careful and not just like quickly try and do things at any point, because it can come back to cause twice the amount of effort just to get back to normal. And I've messed up plenty of code bases in my time. it's a very, it's a very like normal thing to happen. Well, I mean, even the boss, like, you know what? Like, if your boss expects this stuff to never happen, like if you're doing this all the time, if I was your boss, I'd be kind of worried. But like, this is part of programming, man. It's yeah, like it has to be like, okay, like, hey boss, I didn't mean to do this. Like, accidents happen, and like if he or she is not, like, if someone gets that angry because you screwed up like a couple commits or something, like there's no reason. It's not a good place to work. This happens very frequently in the real world. So if he's your boss, if he or she's gotten to that point where they're a boss, I would hope they've been through this themselves and they're a little more understanding that it happens. And if they really care about it, then they should be enforcing some restrictions, like I was showing you with the branches. Like there's ways. First of all, it's never the end of the world. Like, no matter what you do to a code base, if you're using source control, you can pretty much always get back to a state that you want, right? That's why you use source control, so that you can make mistakes and you can revert them. Now, it is possible to like wipe out even the possibility of reverting. Like, you'd have to really mess it up. But even that, like, there's always a way to fix it. And if it takes a lot of work, like, then just take a lesson out of that, right? Like, what did I do wrong here, and how do I avoid this going forward in the future? And one of the ways I just showed you to possibly avoid it is to enforce, enforce somebody reviewing the code, especially if you're on a team. That's like pretty important, right? And that's, you can do that with protected branch rules. That's one way to do it. And there's other ways, like, well, I don't know. That would be the easiest way, especially if you're using pull requests already. I mean, it shouldn't be too hard. And I'm not trying to make that sound like easier than it is, but it shouldn't be too bad. Like, there is, you have the tools, right? Well, like, in order for those files to get in there, like, you obviously did something that added those files, okay? So whatever, you ran an installer or whatever, it added files. Doesn't matter how you got there, but you got those files there. They won't just commit by themselves, right? You have to add them, right? So if I add like a bunch of new files to this, they don't just show up, right? Even if I added those files and then I went over and I was like, okay, I'm gonna do some real, like, normal work, and I was like, da 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 da. All right, I made a real change. At some point, like, you have to decide that, not decide, but you have to perform an action to get all these other things that I, like, in this case, that I don't want to be in there. I have to add those manually, right? So by the time you get to a PR, they're already committed. You've already committed those files, right? Because to get to a PR, you have to commit, you have to stage, you have to commit, and you have to push, and then you have to open a PR, and then you have to merge. But the only place to get extra files in there is during the stage, and that's the git add command, right? So if I was using the command line, and this is another reason why I don't necessarily like the command line, unless I do get status, look, there's like a list of, I don't know how many files here. Let's say there's 50 files, right? I do get status, and I don't really have an indication that that's the case. If someone else added a commit to your PR, that is possible, but that would also show up in the history. So you would have a commit from somebody else in your PR, unless it was merged by doing a squash. But it is important for you to find out what happened, not to blame somebody, but to know, like, for next time, like, how to avoid this problem. So I like the GUIs because I can clearly see that like 44 things were changed, and I was like, oh, I didn't mean to do that. I was just trying to edit this one thing. But I can see that, like, without even getting to the point where it could be messed up, I'm already seeing that, hey, like, I wasn't expecting 44 things to be changed. So I can go, oh, all these files were added. I don't want these files, so, let's get rid of them. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is all I wanted to happen. So yeah, hopefully that helps you. Again, it's hard to like Git can get pretty unwieldy. Like it does give you the ability to essentially fix anything unless you've got some really weird workflow or really weird way of working with it. But it's definitely there, and don't think of it as the end of the world. And like I said, if you get in trouble for this in any sense of the word, you're probably not at a great organization unless you're doing it all the time. In which case, I mean, that's not something that should be happening all the time. So that's on you to get a better understanding of Git and GitHub, and kind of like that's part of your job as a developer. Even if you were hired to like, because you're really good at like CSS, if part of your job is to work with Git, then you have to learn Git. Just like if you're really good at, I don't know, writing technical papers, you probably need to get good at like Microsoft Word or something. Like that's just part of your job, even though it's not like what the end result. No one cares about the end result, but everyone only cares about the end result. But it's your job to use the tools and the software correctly. And Git is one of those things that I think people, when they're first starting, especially, I know it took me a while to like learn how to work around Git, but having a GUI makes a big difference because Git is very much old school, Linux command line, that kind of stuff. And if you're used to that and that's your thing, that's fine. But I prefer to have a constant picture of what's going on all the time without having to like type commands. But again, it's like whatever works for you. If someone on my team says to me, yeah, I use Git command line, I'm more comfortable with Git command line, but they're making mistakes like this, they're accidentally committing things, or they're making mistakes, then I have to say, like, this is not, what you're doing is not good enough. It's not, you might think you're better at this way, but you're clearly making mistakes. So yeah, that kind of falls on you at that point. But again, once or twice, couple times, like really, it's not the end of the world. Yeah, I would recommend SourceTree. It's a good program. I think it can't hurt. Like it's really not going to slow you down in any way. Um, so we got a couple more viewers here. If you're just joining in, I am building a component library for no good reason other than before I start building anything real, I like to build, well, even when I build real things, I like to share components between those things so I don't have to do them more than once. So I don't have anything specific in mind, but there are a set of like base components I know I'm going to need. And right now I just decided I wanted to create a login form, like a more complicated component. And I'm using a tool called Storybook to develop these in isolation from an application. So this might seem weird, but a really useful way I've found to develop front-end applications is to pull out the pieces and develop them in isolation, right? So I have a login form which uses inputs and labels. And if you make each piece work, and React can help you, React is the reason you can do this, then when you put them together, it's like really fast to just assemble the pieces. So I'm going to make a login form, which of course is not actually going to log into anything, but it should perform the duties of, it should provide me the functions I need, like the functionality I need to actually perform a login somewhere. and we want to do some validation as well. So if I said like, okay, like first thing I want to do is like maybe I want to clean this up a bit. I want to be able to put these fields in groups. So I created a component called a form field, and a form field is going to represent it's the responsibility of a form field is going to be to align the things like like the label and the input, for example. So right now, if I say I want form fields, oh, I got to. So form field right now is just a div. It's nothing. So this won't do anything. But let's say I want the label to sit on top of the text boxes by default in a form field. So I could do like, well, there's lots of ways to do this, but I can do this and then oh, I'm not running. Oops. I'm not running my environment right now. Just gotta fire that back up. Just close that one, refresh the one I had open. Right, so now they're on top of each other, right? So that's good. So now if I go to my form field, I want to write stories that demonstrate what form field does. So I just used it in my login form, but I actually want to, before I put it in my login form, I should have done it this way, where I should have actually written a story that shows how this is actually going to be used. So let's bring in input from input, and let's bring in label from label. So now I have an idea of what a form field looks like by itself, and I kind of know that when I just put it in a form, that's what I'm going to get. And this is going to get a little more complicated later. Like right now, this is like really bare bones, so this is like kind of overkill, but we are architecting this in a way that is scalable. And the other nice thing about Storybook is that if I'm like a developer that's just going to be using this, I can see what all the things are already. Like I can see that there's an input and there's a, I can see what these things are. Like, oh, what's a form field? What's a login form? Well, this is what a form field is, just one piece of a form. Also, actually, wait, I actually want to, yeah, so my login form is made up of form fields, right? Login password, and then I want buttons. I want to submit buttons, so I'm gonna make, I already built button. So if I put this in here, I can do this. But obviously now I need to align. I need to align this a little better. So I'm gonna put the button in a container, and I'm gonna call it form actions. And this is just a, well, actually, hold on. Let me do this properly. It's gonna be called form actions, but it's gonna be its own component. So I'm gonna rename form actions dot stories. And actually, this will be display. This will be a row. This will be horizontal. So I don't need these, but I want buttons in here. So this is going to be form actions. Oops. So I'm going to put buttons. Right, these are somewhere else. All right, so now I have form actions, and I probably want form actions to be spacing these buttons a little bit. There's a bunch of ways to do this. Oh, hey, we got new viewers. Hey guys, how are you, guys and girls? My day is going just fine. I'm in Canada and it's Thanksgiving weekend. Not that it matters because I don't have a job right now. But it's Thanksgiving weekend and it's a nice day out, and I went out this morning and now I'm gonna do some coding this afternoon for fun. So I'm glad you guys are along with me for the ride. And we're gonna explore some different ways to build UIs for like real applications, like real applications. So yeah, man, it's all good. I do need to write code for how to. I'm really bad at chat. Can I play? I can play the guitar in the background later. I can't play it now. I could play it now, but I don't want to deter all the people who actually want to see coding getting done. So one of the ways you could arrange these buttons is you could do something like this. I could do like inline, like margin, right? And that works. I don't like the fact that, well, I shouldn't say that. Part of what bothers me about doing this is that I'm just assuming there's buttons in there. But it's also like when you're making these decisions, maybe I should show another way to do this first. Anyways, when you're making these decisions of like how you want to arrange your styles, try and remember what is the response. Just think, what is this component responsible for? So a button, for example, like I could put this margin on the button, right? But a button is not responsible for aligning itself in a container, right? It's the job of the container. So what I'm saying is, what is the responsibility of form actions? The responsibility of form actions is to align buttons for a form. So this is actually kind of okay, because that's just the job of form actions. It's assuming there's actionable items in here, and they're going to be buttons. The catch is that, like, what if someone used links instead of buttons? Well, I mean, that's fine. That's like, I should also consider links, right? And the way you test that is you say, well, okay, that's another type of UI state, right? So the default usage maybe has buttons in it, but what if I had links? What did I do here? Oops, can't have two of the same thing. With links. right? So now that doesn't work because all I did was I styled buttons. I didn't style links, but that's okay because if links are another thing that can go in here, well then that's my job, is to develop code that supports all the different states of the UI that go inside one of these components. Let me just catch up on chat here. Subtitle renderer. Ah. Yeah, that's cool. Where do you get the data from? It's got to be added somewhere manually, right? But anyway, so yeah, like when you're deciding these types of things, like the implementation is not as important. It has to be clear to someone though, like this button should not have a style in here assigning its margin for every use case. The thing around the button should do that. So I created form actions, and I know now that form actions work, right? They look correct to me. So now I can put form actions inside the form that I was building. So if I go down to my login form, right, and I have default usage, now I can, oh, the other thing I wanted, sorry, there's no spacing above this button. So one of the things I actually want as well is spacing inside the form actions. So I'm gonna put some, probably some padding on the top. I don't know, there's probably a bunch of ways to do this, but. So now if I check, like, all right, they've got some space above them now. So now if I put them in the login form, I say import form actions from form actions. Now I can just wrap this and I know it's gonna work. All right. So I'm assembling like different pieces. I'm developing the pieces in isolation and I'm assembling them to make larger, more complex components. Reads a text file. Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. In another stream, I went off on a bit of a tangent and I created this scoreboard. And this scoreboard actually reads from this is like completely off topic to what I was building. It has nothing to do. I just felt like building something more interesting the other day. This scoreboard reads from this JSON file from NHL.com. So I just created this, like, I just import the data and I generated a scoreboard. So yeah, man, that's cool. That's fun, taking some data and making it into a nice UI component. That's very cool. But what's interesting is that you can make, what I like to do is I like to make the components before I have the data, and I like to make sure that all the different states of them are valid before I start messing with data. Because it doesn't matter what your data looks like coming in. What matters is what your component accepts, right? So when I was building this scoreboard, I was like, I don't know what home team name, home team logo, home team record, I don't know what these fields are gonna be called in the data yet, but I don't care. I know I need these values, right? I know I need the name of the team, the record, the actual score, the game time. These are logos, they're just placeholders. And I don't care what they're called in the data. I can make my component work before I have any data, just by declaring the props and assigning the props. And then all the work you have to do once you get the data is just mapping it to those props. But you already know what props you're going to need. So that's one of my favorite things about React, is that you can build these components before you even have to worry about where the data is coming from or what it looks like. So even here, I'm building a login form, which seems weird because I don't have an application yet and there's nothing to log into. But I know I'm going to need a login form, and I know certain things that I want in the login form. So I can build that in isolation, and I can just hook up props. So for example, like this is going to have validation of some kind. And I don't want this to even work like before it even gets to my application. I just know that there's some validation I want to do, and I only want to know when that validation passes. So when they hit the submit button and validation passes. And we haven't got to that point yet, but that's what I'm going to be working towards. Another thing is that I want some space between the form fields, and there's different ways of doing that, right? Like I could put the space here. I could say, well, I always want form fields to have some padding or some space underneath them. But I don't know if that's always true. Like if I have a single form field, like there's no need to have space underneath it necessarily. And maybe there is in this case, I don't know. But the point is that it doesn't always have to be that way. So I have an option here where I could do this here, or I could do it in the form, like the container that owns the form fields. But I don't really think that's necessary because form fields are always going to be used in the same context. I do want labels inside form fields and the inputs to have a bit of space in between them, but I think I'm gonna put some styling on the label. So let's call it, let's say, first of all, font family. I don't know, Arial, sans serif, and I want to put. Well, actually, I don't want to put padding. I don't want to put spacing on a label by itself, but I do want to put spacing on a label in a form field. So I'm going to do this syntax again, where I say, hey, if there's a label inside of here, put some space below it. Doesn't matter what the value is yet. I just want to make sure that works. So now my form field, I've edited, it looks okay. And when I go back to my form, I know it works. So that's pretty cool. Right, so let's get to some of the functionality and the validation, which is more fun. So let's say I want to validate something about these fields. I don't know what I want to validate yet, but let's say I want to make sure they're not empty at the very least before they hit submit. So how do we do that? Well, let's go back to our login form. And I want to validate these fields. So where does this validation go? Well, you might think if I want to validate username that I should put the validation inside a username field, but I don't actually know what that, like maybe some sites are going to use this as an email and some are going to use it as a regular username. I don't know. So I can't tell you what your validation is going to be, but what I can do is provide you a prop to tell me being this component, what your form validation is going to, how you want to validate. So I can say that my login form, well, actually, I probably wouldn't do it here. I'm going to do it in the input. So I don't know if I want to make another. I think I want to make another input on top because I want this one to represent just a base input. But I want to make a more complex one that is that wraps a base input. So I'm gonna make another input. And I'm gonna call it a form input, just to differentiate the two. And form input is going to have more stuff to do than just a regular input, even though this might seem redundant at first. Form input. And actually, I'm going to import input from this. And form input is going to be a class for now. Doesn't have to be, but it's going to be a class for now. And it's going to be a class because I want it to have some state. It's gonna return an input, and I don't need children here. All right, this should work now. Oh wait, component is not. Oh, whoops. From React, hello, thank you. All right. Where did that go? Form input. Okay, so form input is an input, right? And I can pass in other props. So there's different ways of doing this. I could just, I'm gonna make this an object and just spread this. And the reason I'm doing that is so that I can do something like if I wanted to be a number, I can do, well, actually, there's two ways to do this, right? I could do this. Right, I could do that. This arguably is like a little confusing because if I'm like, whatever, a form input is an input, I should just be able to do this. I don't really want to have to like create another object. So obviously this doesn't work right now. So for this to work, I have to do this. Just take all props that are coming in, pass it along, right? So now it takes the type property I just added, passes it to input, and input is just a generic input, so now the type works. Oh, good, you got your change reverted. That's awesome, man. Yes, good call. All right, awesome, dude. That's good to hear that you it's good to hear that you got that handled. Yeah, GitHub is awesome. They're adding a lot of stuff that, you know, would otherwise have to be like a manual action. So it's kind of nice. So I have my form input now, and I know I want my form input to be a little smarter. So one of the things that I want my form input to do is to be able to validate based on a custom function. So I'm going to create a new prop called validator. I don't know if validator is the right word, but I'm going to use validator for right now. And validator is going to be a function that gets called when certain actions occur. So if I just by default if I just said this dot handle blur, so I'm going to create a function called handle blur, and that takes an event. Not that that's going to be necessary, but let's just make sure that works. Well, I know it's going to work. So handle blur is going to take an event, and let's just console log the event just to get it hooked up together. Handle blur equals this dot handle blur. Oops, on blur. Sorry, on blur. So I'm saying when you leave this form input, I want to call this function, and I expect to see an output here, which I do. Okay, that's good. So I know that's hooked up, and the next thing I want to do is actually say, well, when blur occurs, I also want to call the validator. So instead of logging, I want to say this dot validator. And validator, I don't know it exists, so I don't want to assume it exists, because then if someone doesn't pass a validator, this will crash. So I'm going to say if this dot validator, then this dot validator. And another way to write this is like that. But so my validator right now, I haven't passed the validator in, but if I went back to my form input and I said with custom validator, and then I say, I don't need this type right now, I can just say validator equals, and let's create a function, and let's just like alert something here to make sure this gets called. So now when I tab out of this, I should expect to see my alert. Oops, hold on. I didn't. What did I do wrong here? Oh, I'm so stupid. Okay. It's not this dot validator, it's this dot props dot validator. And actually all the better reason to do it this way. Now I expect to see, there we go. Okay, so now it's working. So I know that now when blur occurs, I can call a custom validation event. Let's save this so this doesn't keep happening. And I don't know what the validator is going to be yet, doesn't matter, but it's going to return true or false. So I'm going to just return false here for now. And the validator is not just going to run, I actually want it to run and also tell my program that this field is valid or not. So if I put some state in here now, and I say is valid, and let's say that by default it's going to be valid. But when the value changes, I want to check if it's still valid. So what I'm going to do, and actually I'll put some visual indication when this is valid. Well, actually, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. Well, actually, I could do it this way. So I'm going to put is valid here, and I'm going to pass it into my component. And this is now passing into input. And input doesn't do anything with that property yet, but I can make that happen. And to do that, I'm going to first go over to input and write these in isolation. So I want to say default usage, and then valid state, valid, invalid. And I'm going to say is valid equals false. So by default it's valid, and then I can pass in a property telling if it's invalid. So if I go over to my input and I look at invalid, so there's no difference right now between these two, but now what I can do is go over to my styles and I can use these props. So I can say is valid, and I can put some CSS for when it's valid, where I can say, well, actually I can do this two ways. I can say like border color is valid, yes, then green, otherwise red. Right, so now I have valid and invalid, but these are not yet working yet. What did I do wrong here? Is valid, green, red, right. Okay, so is valid is false. Is valid is true. So that's green, that's red. And the reason you want to define this instead of just having it by default is because there's like a third state, right? It's not just valid or invalid. There's also like idle, like untouched. So you have to actually specify if you want it to show as valid or invalid explicitly. So now it's green if it's valid and it's red if it's invalid. And that's just the input. Now if I go to my form input, right, now this one is also, because I'm setting a valid state here by default, the form input always shows valid or invalid by default. And I might want to change that later. I might not want that to be the case, but it doesn't really matter right now. But the validator is going to determine if it's valid or not. And there's a bunch of ways to do this. You can actually have this input do all this work itself. So I could say set valid state, and I could say this dot set state is valid, and then I can do this. And then I can say this dot set valid state. And this should still work. And this now turned invalid because my validator just returns false, guarantee. It doesn't actually check the value of the input. But what I actually want to do is check the value of the input. So I want to go back here and I want to say, well, I want to set valid state, but I also want to pass the value of the actual text box to check. So value goes in here, And then instead of just calling validator, I'm going to pass validator with the value. And now here, what I'm going to do is say, I get my value in here, and I want to say return val. And so this is a shorthand syntax, right? What I'm really saying here is not equal to, so this is valid if val is not equal to an empty string. So that should be valid, and then this should be invalid, which is not working. So that's already a problem. So let's have a look at why that's not working. So in my form input, this is probably wrong. I think it's actually event.target.value. That's probably the issue. Yeah, that was it. So the issue, I just happen to know off the top of my head that I wasn't passing that correctly. So that's what the problem was there. So it was just reading the wrong thing. So now if I put something in and I tab out, it's green. If I erase it and I tab out, it's red because it's invalid. It just so happens that this is also the same as, well, I shouldn't say that. This is a JavaScript lesson. If I did this would actually still work for empty strings, right? But it would also inadvertently work if I put 0. Well, actually, even 0 works because it's a string. But if I did, yeah, it's because it's a string. So it's actually, even that is fine. But if you look at this, you're not, like, if you're a developer, you're not really clear like what this is doing. So I'd like to be a little more clear and just say, like, make sure the value is not equal to an empty string. That's really what I care about. I don't really care about the type coercion that's going on behind the scenes here. And also this is application code. Like, this wouldn't be in my component library. I might have some pre-built validators. But this generally, like, the application decides what's valid, because the reason for that is, like, well, actually that's the next part we're going to get to here. So I've set up an event that gets called on blur, and it calls this function which passes the value, and then a custom validator, if one exists, checks if this is valid. So this one doesn't have a custom validator. So this will be, this is false because I don't have a custom validator. So this is actually wrong. This is a bug. If you don't supply a validator, I don't want to set a valid value. I don't want to set a value for is valid at all. So actually, I want to change this to say if validator is actually passed in, and, well, I don't know if I want to do this yet, but I'm going to do it for now because I want to be kind of specific here. Well, I was going to say if it's not a function, but you know what? I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to, yeah. So if you pass me a validator, then I'm going to check if the state is valid. So now when I do this, it shouldn't be validating empty string, because I didn't pass, in this particular story, I didn't pass in a function to validate, but with this one I did. So this one should, yeah, so that works. So that's a better way of writing this component. I'm gonna commit this because there's quite a bit of work I've done here. So let's get all this in here. Add some more form components and simple validation. By the way, if you want to see this code, I'm pushing it all to this repo here, which is publicly available. And this doesn't do all these things yet, but this is going to be doing all of these things. I could actually set that up now. I could have set up some of these now. I want to get some actual code in here first, but yeah, this is okay. My issue right now with this component is that it just assumes everything's happening on Blur, which is certainly not the case. So there's a bunch of different ways of doing this. One of the ways is you could do something like, you know, validate. You could pass another prop, validate on Blur, which would be a Boolean, and then you'd say, you know, am I validating this on Blur? If yes, then handle that event. Otherwise, just don't handle that event. And that's not bad. It's not great either because I'd have to have many of these. Another way of doing this would be to like take an array of events you want to support. So something like validate on events. And this would be an array of events, and I would just check. In fact, I could abstract this, say validate on Blur equals validate on events dot what is it, find dot this would be an array, so whatever, it'd be like dot find, you know, event, and event dot event equals Blur, and that would be the same thing, except instead of syntax error. Really? Have syntax error here? Really? Oh, I've redeclared. Right, I redeclared this. Oops. Yeah, so that's fine. So find is not working, but that's because I didn't. There's nothing in that array by default. So if I go over here now and I say, okay, this validates, you know, validate on events, and I could do here. So right now, just to show this does not work, right? It should be going red. If I put Blur in here as one of my array entries, now this should work, and it does. So that's another way to do it. This one's a little more scalable, possibly, because, like, as a user, I don't necessarily want to write validate on Blur, validate, you know, equals true, validate, oops, you know, validate on key down equals true. I could do this, right? Or I could do this. And this is a little more scalable. There's trade-offs with this too. This is a little more scalable because I don't have to know all the events in advance and program them in. But at the same time, if you were to write this component correctly and put prop types then I would define, instead of just, you know, validate on events being, I don't even have prop types installed here, but like instead of just being an array, which isn't super helpful, instead I could actually have defined events here, right? So validate on blur is going to be prop types dot boolean, right? So this is a little more clear. I could just select which ones I want this way versus having to supply a list of them and like type them correctly and everything. But I don't know if I don't know. One way is more work for me, the other way is more work for the user. But I think I like the scalability of just having an array. Yeah, anyway. I don't have prop types installed, so that's why this is failing. But that's how I would do it eventually. I don't know where this came from. And that way, when you supply a validator like this, now if the person that's using this wants this to also be an email, they can supply their own function, right? So const is email, is valid email. They could write whatever, you know, regex they want here. Includes something like this. And then I could actually just get rid of this. Is valid email. And now this should fail, but like that should pass, which does. This is not correct, obviously, but the point is that that's more of a realistic scenario where they would pass in. And that way, if someone else wants to use the same component, but they're not using an email, they would further abstract this, like is valid username, and then is valid username could check is valid email, you know, and I don't know, whatever, like you know, val.length greater than 8 or something, like if it has to be 8 characters or something like that. So you can yeah, you can completely abstract that into whatever your application needs, right? So now this should be invalid, but then if I put enough characters, now it's valid again. So you can keep taking that to the nth degree as far as how far you want to take it. But that's the pattern you want. You want to pass in a validator. So input, the responsibility of input is not to actually check validation or anything. It's just to pass along this value that it can use for styling. But form input has more responsibility. That's responsible for rendering an input and passing in the valid value from its own state. Now, this is still not quite, well, okay, this is fine. But another thing I want to do is have a valid and invalid state for an entire form field. So like maybe I want the label to also be restyled based on the valid state. So this doesn't work right now because the valid state is only in the input, right? So I need this valid state to also be higher up in the tree. Whoops, form input, form field. So I actually need the entire, I need the label to know if it's valid. And I also need the input to know if it's valid. Ooh, what did I do here? So there's a bunch of different ways of doing that, as everything. And I don't know how I want to do it yet, but I can always start by so I could actually move this up. Yeah, I'm trying to think of how I want to handle this. I suppose it's fine to say that part of the responsibility of the form field component is going to be to keep the valid state of its children, which would be the label and the text box or input. So I think I'm going to do that. I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to make this the container element. So I'm going to render container and children. And, right, I need React for that. Children is not defined, right? That's because children comes from props. Form fields on form field. Anything else? Form field, nothing was returned from render, right? Because I'm not returning. There we go. Okay, back to where we were. All right, so now I don't want this blur event, but I do want a state. And I do want to be able to set this state is valid. And so this time we're not doing it from a validator function. We're just gonna pass this in. But I want the child component to tell this component if it's valid or not. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to actually use render props. So I'm going to render children as a function. I should put a check on here. So if children, then render this, otherwise render nothing. And children is going to be a function that is going to take state. And now when I go over to, well, actually I don't want to force someone to use a render prop here. Well, do I? No, I guess I don't. So I'm going to do something else. If use render props equals children and children. So is there children and is children a function? If that's the case, then use render props. Then do that. Otherwise, just render normally. Now this should be backwards compatible. Yeah, cool. So now I don't have to use render props, but I can. So what does that mean? That means now I can go over here and I can say with validation. So I can say now let's pass is valid. And is oops. Right, is valid. This has to return a single element, so I'm gonna have to return a fragment here. And that should fix that. This is ugly. Why is it doing this? Okay. And now I can pass is valid in here. And I can pass is valid in here. And I can make this a form input. And I can say validator, sorry, I don't have to pass is valid here because this tells me if it's valid. Validator equals, and I'll make a function. Actually, I can just copy my, I should move these somewhere common. I'm gonna do that actually. I'm gonna create utils folder. And I'll just put index. Oops. And I'm gonna move these functions, even though these aren't written correctly yet, but like it doesn't matter. Just hook it up to start, and then we can perfect it later. So I just got a simple is valid email, is valid username. These don't do anything real, but I'm going to import is valid username from utils. Utils. Cool. So that with validation. Oh, I haven't done that one yet. This is the one I'm looking at. Yeah. Okay, so this should still work. Cool. So now I can use those here. So I can say is valid username. And now here, well, first of all, that's going to work, but I need to fix label so that it actually has a valid and invalid state. So I'll go over to label stories and I say valid state. I can say is valid equal, I don't have to put true. This is a valid label. And then I'm going to do invalid state equals false. So now valid state, invalid state, of course, they're the same right now. But if I go now into here, I can say the same thing I did on my form field, my form input. I can say color is going to be green if it's valid, red if it's invalid. So now that works in isolation. And actually, this is a bit wrong because default should not be invalid. So this needs to be more than just a ternary expression. This needs to be, well, this is tricky because this is only one of two values. And I want this to be maybe it doesn't make sense to have green as valid. Maybe valid should just be the base color. But at any rate, I want to actually only do this if the valid parameter is supplied. So there's a bunch of ways I could do this. But for now, I'm just going to make it so that invalid is, actually just the default state because that's actually makes sense. So invalid and default should be the same, and then valid should be green. And now if I go over to my form field where I'm using this, so now this default usage should do nothing. With validation should be doing something, but it's not at the moment. Just gonna refresh this because it's been a little finicky. So nothing's rendering, so that makes me think there's like an error here somewhere. Functions are not valid as React child. This will happen if a component returns component from render. Okay. Style component div form field. Okay, so something's wrong with my children here. Oh, maybe this is wrong. Is this supposed to be function? No, that was right. Why isn't this working actually? Can I not? I can't do this. That's what it is. Possibly. hell? Hmm. Yeah, this is invalid because this container is not. All right, yeah, I have to do this. And this should blow up for different reasons. That's good. And now over here. This needs to be a function. I don't like this API right now. I'm gonna have to find a way to make this better. Something's still wrong here. Oops. Okay, tempted to spread. Okay, I'm probably using this somewhere else now. Login form. Yeah, so this now has to be a function as well. Is valid. It's gonna be a prop. And I have to put fragment, which I could do this way, I think. Yep, that's valid. Okay, so now I have these that should be okay, and now where is this blowing up? Attempted to spread non-orbital instance. That means that actually, why am I doing that? That makes no sense. There was no reason to spread state there. Right, so now I have these, and there's another way to write this, by the way, but there now I have at least, well, I should put this where I was trying to test it. So is valid, and in my form field stories, this now should be, yeah, so the username's green, and if I do this with validation, yeah, so now I expect this to be turning red, which it's not. Actually, I expect the text box to be red, and this should be black, which is not happening, so we got to figure out why that's the case. Oh, right, that's not happening because I'm not actually calling set valid state yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this dot state, and I'm also going to pass. So in pass state, I'm also going to pass this function, which is this dot set valid state. And then in my actual form use case, I now have access to set valid state, and I'm going to pass this as I'm going to pass this into here, and then in my form input, when this actually changes, I'm also going to call the other function. So I'm going to do it this way instead. I'm going to say const is valid equals validator. And then this can be the same, but I also want, actually I don't need to keep this here, but I'm going to do it anyway. So if someone passed in another function that is valid, now this should work. It does not. If set valid state, call set valid state with is valid. So let's see if that's actually being called here. So that's part of form field. Let's call console.log. Actually, let's just do alert is valid. Right, so that's not firing either. So let's see what's going on here. There's actually no errors. Okay, so there's no errors, so it's nothing like obvious. Console.log, this is not being called, I assume. Okay, so I'm passing set valid state as a function into form input. Form input has its own set valid state that should be getting to this point. And actually, let's see what this is. Oh, that's not even firing. Why is that not firing? I'm an idiot. That's because it's because I didn't tell it to actually pass. I didn't actually tell it to validate on blur. So my bad. So validate on events equals blur. Yeah, That works. Okay, that was my problem. That's fine. It's working as intended. So now if I go back here, form field, stories. Right, so now is valid, gets passed in to the label. And now the label should be going black if it's valid. So, sorry, it should be going black if it's invalid, which is currently the case. So that's not happening. So let's figure out why that's happening or why that's not happening. Label is getting invalid, is valid is coming from form field. Form field is not defined correctly. So yeah, when this gets invoked, this was the element. It wasn't this particular class. So now this should be working. Okay, that works. Cool. So good. So now the label goes black and the field goes red when it's not valid. My test. And I actually have redundant state right now. I have is valid is inside here. It's also inside the form field. So I think I'm gonna, or in the input. So I think I don't know if I want to move it out of here. It's not really redundant because you could use the form input without a form field. So I kind of want to actually leave it for now. The problem now is that my form field can't render the styling it needs to render. Oh, we don't want this in here. Which makes me think this should be moved up to another component. Well, actually, maybe not. Maybe form field does do this. And instead of having to use fragments here, I could use something else like a const flex container. And then this would be, well, yeah, no, the fact that this is in here already makes me want to not do what I'm about to do. I'm gonna do it the other way. Instead of making this something useful, I'm gonna create another component. Which is gonna be form field, I'm gonna call it manager, which maybe is I don't know why people are so weird about that kind of stuff, but I'm gonna call this the form field manager. It doesn't need stories because it's not gonna actually render anything. But the form field manager is gonna do all this crap for us. It's not going to have any styles or render anything. And the form field will actually render what it was rendering before. Now, what I can do is I can, instead of this being required, I can do form field. Well, actually, maybe form field manager should have stories. Never mind. Form field manager. And now these will become, so basically everything in here that's a form field right now becomes a form field manager. And everything that's a fragment becomes a form field. So this is going to be form field. And then we can get rid of the fragment and actually do this a little cleaner. So form field stories no longer need the form. So now this is no longer in charge of dealing with that. That's what the manager is for. Form field is just going to be in charge of styling again. Form field manager is valid, not defined. It's in form field stories. Right, is valid is, instead of being with validation, this is now going to be valid state. And is valid is going to be true. Don't need these. And invalid state is valid will be false. And now form field has its two states. Well, three states, I guess. And then form field manager does the same thing, but it actually supplies that valid state. So this is actually interactable. This actually will do invalid, and with this one will not anymore. This is always the same state. So that's a common problem when building when you have to decide how to organize these properties, like this kind of state. It's sometimes it's hard to decide how to do that. And the key thing I did was that I made, instead of making form field try and do everything, like styling and behavior, I extracted the behavior into a form field manager. And then the form field now is just responsible for styling. And I should fix the label. This should not be just green or black. This should be, well, actually there's a, the way Angular used to do this, then I kind of, you can do this like, cause there's different, like there's really three states, not just two. So it's either valid, invalid, or idle. So I actually want to check if it's valid, then do green. Otherwise, if it's invalid, do red, otherwise do black. I think that's proper syntax. So now this will be black, but if I do invalid state, instead of is valid being false, is invalid is going to be true. And now this should turn red. Good. So we have default, valid is green, invalid is red. Yeah, okay, that feels a little better. And then in my form field, the reason this is invalid, or this is the reason it's not showing up correctly, is because instead of just doing is valid true, I need to do is invalid true. And now this should be red. Yes. And the form input should also respect that property. So I'm going to copy what I did over in label. And I'm going to put it in here. But I'm going to make this border color. Cool. So now in here, is valid has to be passed in, and also is invalid has to be passed in. And is invalid is going to be determined a little differently. So these should actually be false. Both of these should be false to start because it's an idle state. And now in addition to setting the valid state, I also want to set the invalid state. So I actually could do these all in the same function. Is invalid, or is valid is yeah, and then is invalid is going to be the opposite of is valid. And set valid state. Set invalid state is going to have to be another function. Right, so now I have to go back and pass that in. Form input, form field manager. This be set invalid state. And is valid will be false by default is invalid will be false by default. And this has to be passed in here. Set invalid state equals this dot set invalid state. Okay. So now these two things are being supplied to the children. Children are over in the stories. So this is default usage, set valid state, set invalid state. And then this is going to be is valid equals is valid, and is invalid is going to be is invalid. Default valid should be green. Oh, I'm not wait, no, sorry. This should be set valid states. And the input form field stories valid invalid is invalid equals true. So I'm passing that in to here. Oh, whoops, just a typo. Is valid equals true. Okay, now they're both green. Default, green, red. Idle, valid, invalid. Good. Form field manager should be black by default. It's going to be red if I do that. And actually, that's wrong. Form field manager. This should be red, I expected here, so that's not working. So let's see why that's the case. It's being passed in. So it works. Label works. So invalid label works. So why is this not passing in invalid? Let's go take a look at the field manager. This looks correct. It's because I didn't pass that correctly. But that's cool because I can see the individual items working on their own. And that's the important part here, right? Like I knew the problem was in here because my label works, right? Like I know this works if you pass it the right prop. So that's it. You can shut down label. We're good to go. And I knew that form field works if you gave it the right values. So if form field manager wasn't working using those components, that means it had to have been something inside form field manager. And now that works with valid and invalid states. So let's commit that. It's like a weird delay here. Ugh. Yeah, this is a little bit laggy, this program on Windows. What did we do here? So we added more advanced validation, I guess. Something like that. All right, so we've actually got, this is only mostly from today. We've got quite a few things here. We've got some working, oh, that looks wrong. Oh, right, I didn't update login form. I should probably update login form. So now form field, actually, so login form now needs another component, which is form field manager. Oops. And form field manager is going to replace form field. And fragments are going to be form field. And now, what did I do? I have a syntax problem somewhere. Right, because this is wrong. So now, cannot resolve form field. That's probably in the stories. Nope, it's not. Why would it be trying to do that? Form field manager should not be importing form field at all. Are you lying to me, Storybook? Cannot find module form field. Where the hell is that happening? The heck is going on here? I feel like my, oh, no, this is right. I feel like my auto import setting I put in Visual Studio Code is throwing me off here for login form.stories is calling login form. Login form is importing form field. Why is that not working? Why can you not find form field? Tell me why you can't find form field. Did I spell this wrong? No. I am super confused here. What? Oh. There we go. It was a really uninformative error, actually. Had nothing to do with form field. It was completely not at all form field. Okay, so cool. So now my login form, right? This will never do any validation yet because I haven't actually hooked up any validation yet. But I could do that right now very simply with validator equals, and let's just say that the string I put in has to be value. I'm going to say that the value equals Terry. If it's not Terry, this should be, this should be on the input, not the field. So if the username is not Terry, this is going to be invalid after well, actually, it won't do anything right now, but if I say validate on events equals, and I say blur, now this should actually be invalid. Not working. Let's find out why. Oh, because this is not a form input. This is just an input. So this has to be a form input. That's why. Because input does not have that behavior, but form input does. So that works. God, it's like so easy to find these problems with React. When you're when you're working with like Angular, man, it's like just being able to figure out where these things have gone wrong. So much harder. Okay, I'm gonna update complex components with new structure. All right, cool. So that's pretty good. I think I'm gonna stop there for today because I gotta eat some food and stuff and take the puppy outside. So thanks for everyone who's been watching today. And if you're in Canada, happy Thanksgiving. If you're in somewhere else, then happy Sunday afternoon. And I will most likely be back on tomorrow afternoon, Eastern time. So we'll see you then.